to be able to host this. And I know John has prepared some good information for us on how to file for a letter of map revision. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started. Oh, and I guess I should introduce myself for those that don't know me. I'm Tara Leemsrath. I'm the floodplain mapping coordinator with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I can turn my camera on here for a minute. So we got funding through our FEMA CTP grant to host this training, and so happy to be here today. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you. As John mentioned, please keep yourself on mute. You can use the chat box there to ask any questions. And I think we may have times to stop at different times during the training to ask if you have any questions, but since we do have a large amount of attendance, if you can keep yourself on mute and then just use the chat or designated times for questions, that'd be great. So thanks everybody. And John, I'll turn it to you.
All right, thanks Tara, appreciate it. So for those that don't know me, my name is John Covey. I currently work for Wood, and no, I do not sell dimensional lumber. We do water resources engineering projects and assist with LOMRs and LOMRs across the nation, really. I've been with the company for 16 years now, doing this same type of work across the country. I'm not going to show my video because I don't want everybody to see my mullet. You know, I'm bringing back the trend for the post-COVID thing. So, but there's a much better picture of me there. Hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. I really appreciate the opportunity to take the time to do this workshop with everybody. I recognize there are probably a lot of practiced, experienced folks on this call. With that being said, when we originally designed this workshop, we had kind of hoped that it would be more personal. It would be more about showing specific examples and getting feedback and experience from the wider group as we go through these workshops, because I really feel like that's where we learn a lot more. We've revamped this agenda to try to accommodate this more virtual environment. And so we've split the original workshop into two parts. This first part, which is the part today, we've got a couple hours here today to do this brief introduction. I'm going to go over LOMAC, an overview of what a letter of map change is and all the different components and parts of that. And then also in this first part, I'm going to talk about the MT1 applications. And specifically, we're going to go through examples. I'm going to pull up the actual forms. We're going to talk through those forms and provide some lessons learned in those. Part 2 will be tomorrow. And for part 2, I'm actually going to do a short little recap at the front of part 2. So, that we had some people join in tomorrow that couldn't join today. So I'll do a short little recap to get them kind of up to speed really quick. But part 2 is going to focus more on the MT2 applications, how to file, where the different components are coming from, and again, kind of talk through those. And then we'll also have an exercise where I'm going to show an actual example of one. Oh, we got some feedback. And then we'll also have a little bit of lessons learned as well. So the goals of this project is, honestly, I'm taking a little bit different perspective because I'm going to be talking maybe more from a consultant's perspective on, understanding the LOMAC process, understanding the MT1 and MT2 applications. And while we're talking through this, really highlighting a lot of the lessons that I've learned, and maybe provide some tips on helping to streamline the process. Not perfect. I've had my own set of failures in my past, and so I want to share some of those insights with this group. And then at the end of each presentation today and tomorrow, we've got a period in there where we can ask questions and have a little more interaction. And then Tara didn't mention it, but we have an awesome quiz for everybody. So you guys all get to take a quiz at the end of each of these parts. And if we start seeing the participants drop off, Tara, now we know why.
I will
But
say, and thank you for reminding me that, John, sorry to interrupt, but if you wanted those credits, the continuing education credits, you do have to participate in that quiz at the end. So just wanted to throw that out there.
man, got to be a buzzkill, don't you? No, but then in addition to all that, I hope everybody can have some fun. I recognize the LOMAC process may not be the coolest thing with all the great animations as some of the other stuff and trainings that we sit through, but it's still very important. It's still a critical part of what we do and informing the mapping process. So let's have some fun as we go through this, and hopefully the slides aren't going to be too boring for everybody. Format wise, this is a virtual one. So normally if I'm doing this in person, I've got lectures and demonstrations and exercises and what have you. This is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a lot of me talking. So please try to follow along, take down some notes, write down some questions as I go. And then, I'll also interactively bring up some of the websites. I'll interactively bring up the forums, and we'll talk through those and provide more insight into those. Some resources. The first link there, the online LOMAC help link, honestly is probably my go-to link that I go to for all these different types of things, and I'll bring that up real quick. But this is a really good resource that really highlights, a lot of what I'm going to talk about, but does a really good job of answering some of the questions that come out of these. And, it'll talk through, again, a lot of what we're going to go over, including tutorials and how you complete the MT1 and MT2 applications. I think this is a really great resource. So I would put that in your back pocket as we go through this and as you look at it on your own time as well. They also have other resources too. You can email, and they even have a live chat option. So if you want to try to get a hold of somebody live, you can to talk through that. Tara, is the lag very bad on your end?
No, it seems fine to me.
Okay. So they also have a lot of other links up there. There's this flood zone designation website on FEMA's page that you can go to that has more information and access to all the forms. And then, they even have little instructions. And as I said before, they actually have a tutorial that's pretty good for the online portion. And I'll show that tutorial here after a bit. That kind of walks through that process, which is really nice. So let's talk a little bit about the letter of map change, the overview and the process part of it. I'm going to talk about what a letter of map change is, when do you need one, types of LOMACs, what is a no-rise certification. Sometimes there's some confusion about what that is, how it's utilized. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What are the conditional determinations, different form types, what are the application fees? Not everything is free in this world. So FEMA's got to get paid, and their contractors have to be paid to review certain materials. So we'll take a look at those. I've got some quick summary of the timeline for each of the different types generally, and then some additional links or to the helpful resources just as a reminder. So a LOMAC is a letter of map change, and basically it's a letter that reflects an official revision or amendment to the firm. And basically the application process or the different types that there are falls into two categories, the amendments and the revisions part. Amendments, they don't physically change the effective map. So if you pull up a FEMA floodplain map and you have a profile in the flowway data table, when you do an amendment, you're not actually changing that information. You're just providing what I would call an exemption or exception that in your scenario, you are above that base flood elevation or that 100-year water surface elevation. And so it doesn't require, by doing that, generally it tries to remove the requirement of having to have flood insurance for that structure or parcel of property. However, a revision, and those types that fall into revisions, they physically change the effective map. And so in situations like this, is if we're trying to change the floodplain, if we're performing activities that alter the flood course somehow, we want to change the effective map to reflect those revisions or those changes, then you would follow the revision path. When you would need a LOMAC would be when mapping scale, there's limitations associated with being able to pick out an individual structure, or maybe there's some new LIDAR that has come out that has changed the water course. Maybe you're adjusting or removing structures from the floodplain, adding fill. You may have a project that's within the floodplain, or in a floodplain where there's not a regulatory floodway, those type of situations. And if you have a project especially if you have a project that's causing a base flood elevation to increase or decrease, we want to use this process. The intent of the FEMA maps are to, in my opinion, be living information, living risk information. And so the LOMAC process is meant to try to inform those mapping products and try to keep them up to date as best we can, recognizing, when the project was done, when the mapping project was originally done, it was a snapshot in time. And we all know that development and things change over the course of time. And so this process is intended to help keep those documents living and up to date as much as we can, as well as I mentioned before, help us accommodate those smaller scale projects that maybe just cannot be shown on a map. The other thing to keep in mind is I'm going to be talking a lot about the FEMA regulatory process and all the forms associated with that and requirements associated with that. But there are other local regulatory floodplain requirements that should be considered. For example, certain areas I know in the state of Kansas, they have compensatory storage requirements in addition to those requirements that FEMA or the state has. And there's other requirements out there too that maybe you cannot affect the other frequency events, say the 10-year, the 25-year, or what have you. California is a good example of that. They actually have areas where you cannot change the ecosystem of the environment, not just the 100-year base flood elevation. So I just mentioned that. I know we're not in California, but I just want to mention that keep in mind where you're working that there may be other local regulatory floodplain requirements that you should be considering when you're doing these LOMACs. There's 7 different types of LOMACs. There's the LOMA, or letter of a map amendment. There's a CLOMA, a conditional letter of map amendment. A LOMR, letter of map revision. A LOMR F is a letter of map revision based on fill. CLOMR, conditional letter of map revision. CLOMR F, conditional letter of map revision based on fill. And then finally, a PMR, a physical map revision. For the purposes of this demonstration or presentation, I'm not going to talk extensively about the PMR. I think if you have questions about that, I would encourage you to reach out to Tara Lanzareth and the KDA folks to talk more in depth about that process. I'm going to focus more heavily on the first 6 types listed here. So a letter of map amendment is probably one of the more common ones that are submitted. But basically, it's a letter from FEMA that basically says that a structure or parcel is not within the special flood hazard area, or the SFHA. Um, and usually the reason that this is necessary is because you may have a small structure that's shown within a floodplain, and at mapping scale, we really can't remove all those little holes, or we couldn't at one point in time. That's ever changing in our new digital environment. But the idea is that we have a process that gives people the opportunity to accommodate those small scale things that cannot be reflected on the maps. The other reason may be that the topography itself may have had some issues when it was mapped. You know, I'm not going to go into the technical details on that, but just understand that the ground directly adjacent to the building isn't necessarily 100% correct, and because of, you know, the way the data is collected. And so the letter of map amendment provides the opportunity for homeowners and community members and consultants to basically evaluate each individual structure or parcel, and provide the opportunity to amend the effective deep firm map for their given situation. The conditional letter of map amendment, or CLOMA, is basically FEMA's comment on whether a parcel or proposed structure that is not elevated by fill, and that's a key part there. It's not elevated by fill. It's placed on the natural ground. Now simple grading of removing soil and putting soil back that accommodates the foundation structural information of the building is not included in that, but basically it has to be at natural grade. This letter basically says if you're proposing a structure that would be on natural grade, FEMA can review that and provide you a determination of whether or not it would be approved as you've depicted it. A LOMR, or letter of map revision, basically it's FEMA's way or a community's way or an individual's way of modifying the actual flood insurance rate map or flood boundary and floodway map. It's a way of informing of new and better hydrologic and hydraulic conditions. If you're trying to put in a new bridge or build a new levee or dam, those type of projects is intended for the LOMR process, so that we can update the floodplain map associatively with that project, and ensure that it meets FEMA's requirements. That's a key part, is part, and we'll talk about the deliverables as part of that, but as part of the deliverables, you really need to provide that information in a way that can be incorporated into the effective firm, DFIRM, FIS, and supporting information. The letter of map revision based on fill is similar to a LOMA, except that this is intended for those structures or areas in which fill is being placed above grade, so that the elevation of that pad or that structure is then above the base flood elevation. So if you have a structure that's on, or a proposed structure that's going on natural grade, then that is generally the LOMA process. If you have a structure that is being placed on fill to get above the BFE, or the base flood elevation, then that would be the LOMR F process. Both the LOMA and the LOMR F are amendments. They're not intended to change the effective information. They're just intended to amend it and provide the homeowner or property owner with a letter of determination for that given situation. Just like a conditional letter of map amendment talked about a little bit before, this is a conditional letter of map revision, which means that if you are proposing to put in a project this is you provide all the same type of information to FEMA, and FEMA can then provide you a determination, a letter of determination to whether or not, if that is built, would it be approved. And obviously, one of the big reasons to do this would be to mitigate the risk of building a lot of infrastructure that ultimately isn't approved. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the important thing to note here is that a CLOMA, a LOMR, again, those don't actually, they're not determinations, and you can't use those to remove the flood insurance requirements. They are just a determination on what, that based off of what you provided, it could be approved if a LOMA or a LOMR would be submitted in the future after development. And a CLOMR-F is just the conditional letter for a map revision based off of fill, similarly to like the CLOMA, only again, this is for a proposed structure that's going to be elevated by fill instead of placed on natural grade. PMR, physical map revision. Basically, this is like a LOMR. And again, I know I'm not going to talk extensively about this in our presentation, but this is basically a LOMR at a much larger scale. So if you have multiple counties, you have large watersheds, that might be where a PMR comes into play versus filing a LOMR. What is a no-rise? So a no-rise certification is basically your documentation that has been certified by a professional engineer that basically attests that a project or activity will result in 0.00 foot of rise, or a no rise in the 1% annual chance or 100-year event. While this process is recommended, like while it's still recommended, it does remove the requirement for filing a CLOMR. So if you get a no-rise certification, technically based off the FEMA requirements, you're not required to do a CLOMR before a LOMR is submitted. I will say though that it almost always I recommend do a CLOMR first, because the last thing that from a consultant's perspective and from the development's perspective, we don't want activities and fill being placed into the floodplain that could be at risk. And having gone through the CLOMR process provides that additional level of review and assurance that that activity, as long as it's again developed as we said it would be approved in the future. We don't want to put our clients and our communities in an awkward position where they place fill based off of a no-rise certification that ultimately doesn't get approved. Now, there are certainly situations I've been in where the clients have chosen not to do a CLOMR before the LOMR activity. And as long as they understand the risk associated with that, then, you know, that's fine. But I think it's just important to distinguish that at the front end. From a consultant perspective, I want them to make sure that they're aware of that. No-rise certifications are required if the projects are within the effective floodway. And some areas actually a no-rise is required even in the floodplain fringe. Now, I'm not aware of any areas in the state of Kansas. Somebody on here may correct me on that, but certainly it's required for if you're within the floodway. And I'll have an example of that. Talked about this a little bit, but conditional determinations, again, they're really intended to reduce the risk of non-compliance and help streamline the approval process. You know, if you've filed for a CLOMR, for instance, and you've gotten FEMA and the review process to provide a letter of determination saying that, yes, if you build it this way, it will be approved, then as long as you perform those activities accordingly, you're at less risk of being in non-compliance, and you're also help streamline the approval process of the LOMR itself, because the CLOMR was approved, it's a lot easier then for FEMA to go back, and what they're going to check is to make sure that the as-built, or what was built, matches what you said was going to be built. And if so, then it makes their review process a lot simpler. So there's a lot of benefits to that. Obviously, if you're doing a conditional determination like a CLOMA, a CLOMR-F, or a CLOMR, you still must meet the same requirements as the LOMA, LOMR-F, or LOMR. I mean, that's how they're going to make the determination. It's just that it's not a final determination. It's just an opinion from FEMA stating that if you build it this way, yes, you will meet our requirements. Once construction activities are done, then you would immediately follow up with the LOMA, LOMR-F, or LOMR, and you would have to provide certified as-builts so that they can compare that back to the CLOMR, or how it was originally proposed to be built, to ensure that it still meets the requirements and the regulatory requirements. So there are three main application types. There's the, from a form perspective anyways, there's the MTEZ, which is applicable to the LOMAs. There's the MT1 amendments forms, which are applicable to LOMA, CLOMA, LOMR-F, and CLOMR-F. And then there's also the MT2 revision forms, which are much more in depth, and they will cover the LOMR and CLOMR. And then PMR is very similar to that in its requirements as well. So you request, there's several ways that you can request the letter of map change, one of those different types. There's an online LOMAC page, and I will bring that up real quick. This is a really nice platform. Definitely recommend, most of the time that I am submitting these, I am using this online process. It really helps streamline the process as opposed to the manual way of doing things. There's the eLOMA process. It's an online submission, but that process is only for licensed professionals. But it has the added benefit that you can literally get a determination in minutes, as opposed to, and we'll talk about that, but you can literally get a determination in minutes as opposed to waiting like 60 days for your determination. And then finally, there's the mail-in application process, where you can mail all the information, the forms that we'll go over, and digital data, all manually, and through the snail mail process, and submitting that at your own risk. But basically, that's the process for those. So fees, this basically highlights the fees for an MT1 application process. If you're doing a typical LOMA for single lot or single structure, or multiple lot, multiple structure, that's free. And then you can, if you're doing an eLOMA as a licensed professional, that's free as well. The other ones, they require for more review of the information, and therefore there are associated fees with that. And as you can see, the online LOMAC fee is obviously cheaper than the paper form fee, because, well, it's all online, it's more digital. It's easier for them to get to and to get through the information, as opposed to digging through the snail mail that you sent to try to figure it out. For the MT2 applications, has its own fee structure for like CLOMRs and LOMRs. Again, the online is usually cheaper than the paper. The one thing that I want to call out is, you'll notice that for like a CLOMR based off on levee, berm, or other structural measures, there's the base fee, but then there's also an hourly fee. So as a consultant, usually what we do is we basically, in our contract with our clients, we'll basically stipulate, we assume this much in effort on the FEMA side, so that we can contract associatively. Because my preferred method for accommodating these fees from a consultant perspective is I'd rather have those in the contract so that I can go through the online LOMAC process. It's a lot easier, and we just reimburse that back to the client, at a, just a straight cost. You can do it differently. You can do it to where the client submits their fees independently themselves, but it gets a little more messy. And in my opinion, I would just build it into the contract itself. It makes everybody's life a little easier. The other thing that you'll notice on this is that a LOMR based solely on the submission of more detailed data is also free. And there's probably folks on here like Tom or others that may have a better definition than I do, but the way that I would look at that, if it's going to, and I believe they have actually guidelines kind of written to help understand what those actually attest to, but in my opinion, it's got to be like in error, like you have to be able to show that there has been a mapping error of some kind, or let's say that it's a zone A study that was done using regression equations. If you perform a much more detailed analysis, like a detailed HMS model with, and are proposing to change that to a zone AE, then that might fit into that category. But generally, most of the time that I've seen that be approved as a free cost was because there was some sort of error, not really because of better information, but mostly because there was an error. So how long does the application process take? The ELOMA, like I said, is in minutes. The MTEZ and the MT1 amendment forms, usually they're within 60 days. And then the MT2 revisions on average, I've seen it anywhere between 6 to 12 months, but basically they have, FEMA has 90 days, the FEMA reviewer has 90 days to respond to an application. And then you have 90 days to respond back to them when you receive their comments and so forth and so on. And then there's an adoption and an appeal period at the end on some of those, like 4.5 months before the LOMR become effective. So typically, again, on average, 6 to 12 months for the whole process for an MT2, and then the MTEZ and MT1 is definitely within the 60-day window, typically. And those are the resources. Okay, so let's talk about the MT1 application and what it covers. So here I'm going to talk about the MT1 application. What does it cover? What are the forms? What are the requirements? We're going to actually walk through the forms and some examples, and then talk about some additional resources. The MT1 application, again, is the amendments. It's applicable to the LOMA, LOMR F, CLOMA, and CLOMR F. Here are some links to those forms, but more importantly, this is what we really want to walk through. For the MTEZ LOMA, there's 3 requirements that need to be submitted. There's the MTEZ form, a copy of the effective firm, and a stamped subdivision plat map or property deed. Let me pull up that form so we can look at it together. Apologies, my computer is being slow at the moment. There we go. So this is the MTEZ form that's available on the FEMA webpage. And you'll see that it's only applicable for a LOMA. So it has to be an existing structure or parcel of land that was not elevated by fill and would not be inundated by the base flood elevation. The very first question it asks you is, has fill been placed on your property to raise the ground above the previously, or that was previously below the BFE? And so if you select yes here, then they're immediately going to refer you to the MT1 application forms and process, because this is only intended for those existing structures that are out there on grade. The legal description of the property, that's your typical information that you might find from the deed and then the street address. And if you're requiring a flood zone determination to be completed, you would basically check those. So is this a structure that you're wanting to request a determination for? You would checkbox that, and then you would checkbox or put in the month and year of the construction date as best you can. Another option is if you have a legally recorded property. So in other words, what you're providing here is certified meets and bounds descriptions or survey of the property, the boundary, the geographic boundary of the area, so that they can determine where basically the lowest elevation of that area is what the determination is going to be based off of. And then, or the entire legally recorded property is the other option that you can do. The applicant's name, address, all that is pretty standard stuff here. And then as you scroll down, so again, you in this section here, you're requesting what the determination is requested for, and you'll notice again that it's on natural grade here. So again, if it's on fill, this form is not applicable to you, or the legally recorded property. And you'll notice these forms are pretty intuitive in that they tell you what type of information is required. So if it's a structure located on natural ground, then what they're going to be looking for is the elevation of the lowest adjacent grade. So basically that lowest elevation adjacent to the property, which includes like patio stairs or deck supports or garages that are attached to the structure. There's a whole guidance written about where you grab the elevation associated with the structure. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but a surveyor or an engineer that's done these before will understand how to do that for sure. And then if it's just a legally recorded parcel of land or a portion of, what they're looking for, again, like I mentioned, is the elevation of the lowest ground on the parcel. So if you're trying to get a portion of a property, then the meets and bounds polygon, the area that you provide, you want to make sure that all that area is above the special flood hazard area. If any portion of that is lower, that is technically the lowest ground elevation, and therefore from a determination standpoint, it would not be approved. They would only approve, if it's above that. Property information description, again, that can come from the deed. And I'll show an example here in a little bit of that. The structure information, so street address, what type of structure is it? So is it on a crawl space, slab on grade, basement? Again, depending on the type of structure, you would select that option. The geographic coordinates, so the basically what is the location of that point where the BFE is going to be, or the elevation is going to be provided from. So you want, and just so everybody, from a lessons learned, I can tell you one of the biggest things and issues that I've come across is that people have had inconsistencies on the datum that they're using, especially the vertical datum. So here this would come from your surveyor, but basically you would provide what horizontal datum it is in, and then the Latin long associatively with that, where the lowest elevation is. The flood insurance rate map, This can come from the firm panel, which again, as you may recall, a copy of the effective firm is required for this. Thankfully, FEMA has a nice tool for, pull that up, grabbing a firmette that can be copied and pasted. So this is the what they call the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You can go here and just type in an address of a location. So I'll just use one, for instance. Okay. Right there is the property. You can zoom in on it. And you can see all the regulatory information is being shown on this map. And so what you can do is you can actually export this out as a firmette. So if I just hit this print button here, it'll just take a second to load. There we go. So here it shows the property location. It shows all the flood hazard information. It shows the panel that it's on, the effective date, all this information on here. It's all in one nice spot. And so you've literally, by just going through this one process right here, you've essentially satisfied, you satisfied grabbing the copy of the effective firm, as well as filling out this portion of the document, the EZT, the form that we're filling out. So all that is done in one step, essentially. The lowest adjacent grade to the structure is shown to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. This would come from the surveyor. And you can see that there's information again here, like this datum. Again, this is where I see a lot of mistakes being made, that they select the wrong datum or they don't do a datum conversion. So the one thing to keep in mind is the datum of the firm. Most of it now is going to be in NAVD 88. There's certainly areas out there that are not. They're in GVD 29. But if your surveyor does the survey in NAVD 88, but the datum of your water, the BFE is in NGVD 29, then you need to make sure that you do that conversion so that you can check whether or not you would get approved. That is a pretty common mistake that I've seen, and I'm not sure about everybody else, but I know that that's one common mistake I've seen out there. This section here has to be filled out. This is, again, the survey required. So you need a certified surveyor to basically fill in their information here and then seal this information to basically say, you know, this is the lowest adjacent grade elevation of the structure or property that's being, that a determination is being requested for. So again, on this form, they do a pretty nice job of telling you what additional information is necessary. So, you know, a copy of the effective firm panel with the structure being accurately plotted. Again, that this firmette counts as that. You can use this firmette to do that. A copy of the subdivision plat with a recordation stamp or stamp from the recorder's office. There's a, you know, you basically have to reach out to your local jurisdiction's recorder office to get this information. I'll tell you that in a lot of situations I've run across, the plat map may actually not be available. And so if it's not available, then what that means is you would have to go and you'd have to get the property deed, which again is dated, it's stamped, and then accompany that with a tax assessor's map. Or basically a map that shows the surveyed location of the property relative to the streets or the streams in which you're trying to grab it. And I can show you an example of that, what I've done in the past. Let's see here. Second. This is probably a good time to talk about folder structure, but for each of the requirements, I usually will try to make sure the forms are on the outside, and then any required information I put in folders and I number those. So even if something like the subdivision plat map is not available, for instance, what I'll do is I'll actually put something, a letter in here that basically states that the subdivision hasn't been platted yet, and therefore I'm submitting the deed and the tax appraiser's map in its place. And so in the, okay, so then on the property deed side, this is just an example of a deed. So basically, you have the deed of the property with it being stamped and everything by the recorder's office. And then for the tax assessor's map, what I've submitted in the past is basically maps like this. Oh, not that one. Excuse me. This one. That basically comes from the appraiser's webpage that shows the property in question. And essentially, in certain regions, I've seen this actually be accepted as evidence of fulfilling the deed and the tax appraiser's map. Some areas that I've done these submissions in, though, they actually require this to be stamped as well, just like the deed. So just be aware of that. Okay. Then it just says make sure that map scale north arrows on all the maps. And there's a bunch of disclaimers about it. And then finally, depending on where you are located, basically these all get submitted to this LOMAC clearinghouse for processing. So that for an MTEZ, that is pretty much the process. It's a very simple process, really. The key things that just keep in mind for an MTEZ that, again, it's a LOMA for a structure or parcel that is not on fill. If it's on fill, then you have to use the MT1 application forms, which I'm going to go over. And then the other key things that, again, that I've seen mistakes be made on is usually in this geographic coordinate and in this elevation survey information. They don't get the datum conversions applied, or they haven't documented it correctly, which then results into a determination that you don't like because it just wasn't accommodated before. And then a common question that I usually get from homeowners is, should I fill this thing out? Even if when should I fill this out? And usually what I tell them is if you're working with a surveyor that has done these before, they'll tell you when they come out to do the survey what the base flood elevation is, and they will pretty much know whether or not you're going to have a successful determination or not. There's no reason to fill this out if you're not going to pass and pay and go through that process. But this process is an important process. I know that flood insurance is not required for properties or homes that do not have a federally backed mortgage. But this is still an important process to go through, because if you're looking to sell the property or what have you, this documentation lives with the property. And so, as mapping updates are done, these are reevaluated at the end of each of those mapping processes. So it's important to have this accomplished, and provides easier way of potentially selling the property into the future. This might be a good point to see if there's any questions, Tara, before I go to the MT1.
Yes, John. And Steve has had several questions in the chat as well as some comments. And so I don't know if Steve, if you want me to read through them, or do you want to take a minute here, Steve, and ask them yourself or add any additional comments you'd like?
Just read through them.
Okay. So the first question was, why is a CLOMA more expensive than a CLOMR F when a LOMA is free?
To that part of the so the reason for that is because other people on like FEMA side maybe have a better answer to this, but the reason I believe that is true is because they are trying to review plan sets that you would be submitting. So whereas a LOMA is basically you're just providing an elevation. It's already established, it's already built, it's already out there, it's being certified by a surveyor. A CLOMA, you have to submit information that basically presents what you're planning on building, and they need to review that and review the elevations that are being submitted, and therefore there's time associated with that process. And that's why there would be a small fee associated with that, I believe.
Okay, thank you. His next question was, can you dig a basement in a LOMR F?
Can you dig a basement in a LOMR F?
And that was from Steve. So I know Steve may have some input on some of this as well, since he also specializes in this area. So
exactly, yeah, Steve. If you,
John, I'm picking on you. I'm asking you the questions that people call me and ask me all the time because I wanted them touched on in the seminar.
Okay,
right.
I got you.
Okay.
Well, if you want to cover
all right, I'll take that one then.
Yeah.
So once the LOMR F's approved, it's hard for a community to prevent it. But before you get the LOMR F, you are given a community acknowledgement form, which John hasn't gotten to yet. So it's kind of unfair for me to ask that question now, but he had LOMR F MT1 on the slides going. And so the community has to sign a form that says not only the LOMR F, but any proposed development on this LOMR F meets the community's requirements. So if somebody's planning to build a basement doesn't meet the community's floodplain management requirements, the community should not even sign the community acknowledgement form.
Yep, good point. Yeah, and I haven't gotten to that yet, but I'm getting to it.
I knew you were going to talk about it anyway.
So Steve, you had some other questions as well. I can read them.
Just keep going because I
okay. Yep. So the MTE question 1 on fill. What happens if fill was placed before mapped?
Oh.
So John, you want to ask a friend?
Where are you reading this? I'm missing that question.
So the MTEZ question number 1, has fill been placed on the property? You check.
Oh,
you check.
okay. Yeah.
You need to check no for a LOMA,
right,
but if
right,
there has been fill, you go to a LOMR F. But if
Yep.
the fill was placed prior to it being mapped into the floodplain, you grandfather the fill in, you treat it like natural grade, and you check the box no, even though you know it's fill.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
Okay. Another question from Steve, the MTEZ. What if your legal description is too long to fit on the form in the space given?
Good question. What I've done there is I've actually submitted a separate document that basically documents the full description. And so I'll actually
It'll be on your deed.
Yeah, it'll be on the deed. So you just refer to that, and that usually satisfies, or it has in the past.
My legal description was too long for the form, and I did exactly that, and it got rejected. when I did the LOMA for my house. So the reviewer told me to put an abbreviated legal description and then attach the what you said with the deed.
Okay. I've seen it approved the other way, just so you know.
I think every reviewer does it differently.
Yeah,
Yeah, I wish there was more consistency on that, but these are good to know, just so maybe we can cover
absolutely.
how to submit it. Yeah. Okay. And then Steve, you had a comment. John mentioned the format doing the questions for the map information section and not using the FIS. So that was a question or a comment he had.
In the AE zone, I always say to use the FIS to calculate your BFE.
Yeah, yeah. So I can probably show that.
You don't need to show it if you don't want to.
No, that's fine.
I just don't want them to take the
format.
information straight off of the ferment.
Yeah, I can explain that in more detail. Actually, let me pull up that ferment because that's a good point. And actually, that ferment will provide a great example of what you're talking about there. So in this example here that we had before, this is the property or the location in question. And what Steve is referring to is you'll notice that this location is between cross section AV with a BFE of 1296 and then a cross section of AU 1295.2 feet. And so what you would do, and I can pull that up, I think, is you would go to the profile. One second. I'll just pull up an example one. Where is it? Bear with me.
Well, while you're pulling it up, John, I'll just comment that right here in your picture, there's a squiggly line that says 1295.
Yeah, that's the B.
And it's halfway between AV and AU. But if you look at AU, which is downstream where the number should be lower, it says 1295.2.
Right.
So that 1295 in the middle is a rounded off number and it's rounded down. So I've had people get into problems where they used numbers straight off the map that were rounded down and built too low.
Right. So then you'd always want to use the FIS profile for those base elevations, which I think, John, is what you're trying to pull up. There you go.
Hey, hippity hop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was trying to, and this isn't at that exact location, but basically, yeah, you're right. If you have a location that's somewhere in between, then you would want to use the profile between these two cross sections, estimate where that location is, and derive a BFE from that location. So, you know, if we were halfway in between, you measure along the stream channel basically. So as you measure along here, you know, if it's 100 feet or 200 feet downstream, and that's where it would be parallel or perpendicular to the stream channel, then you would basically do that measurement from that lettered cross section and derive the elevation from it. If you know that you place fill well above it, I mean, first of all, I always encourage to do that. I agree with Steve. Definitely do that in every case that you can. I have seen people say, you know what, I built this thing 3 feet above the base flood elevation. I know that it's going to be above it. I have seen people use the conservative elevation and just place that in there that's on the map. Right, wrong, or indifferent, I've seen that done that way.
And that would probably get approved anyway.
It would get approved anyways because you're picking the conservative of the two. And as long as you knew your elevation was above that, then it would be approved. The problem with that is you then have a piece of documentation that may not have the exact elevation on it. So when you're bringing it forward, like if it's reviewed in the future and these elevations change, I mean, that could lead to problems down the road potentially, but it still gets it approved in the end. So All right. What other questions?
Okay, so Steve also asked, how do you treat window wells for MTEZ LOMA?
Window wells.
And so maybe Steve, you have some more input here. And I know Joanna mentioned in the chat that Steve is also doing a class on LOMAs and LOMRs in January. So that's also on our training website. So
So John, the lowest adjacent grade
Right.
is going to be the bottom of the window well.
Right.
And then you could submit a sketch showing the intervening higher ground around the window well and what that elevation is, and make a note that the lowest adjacent grade outside of the window wells is a certain number all the way around the house.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, what you said a sketch, usually I'll take pictures actually of those window wells, and I'll provide that as well. Okay.
Steve, you had, I think, one more question here. It says, explain option for a property owner who already has an elevation certificate from a surveyor that died.
Is there a specific example you're covering there?
Oh yeah, I've had that happen a bunch of times. Have you seen the average age of a surveyor at the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors conference? Nice guys,
can
but a
safely
majority of them
tell,
are white-haired elderly gentlemen.
and I can safely tell you I've not had that problem yet.
Okay, so anyway, if you have an elevation certificate signed off by a licensed professional, you fill out the MTEZ form. When you get to with a section where you need the elevation data, then you can make a note there to see the attached elevation certificate, because everything they're asking for should be on the elevation certificate. So you essentially leave section 5 blank and unsealed, and you tell them to see the signed and sealed elevation certificate for that information.
Interesting. I've never actually had to do that before.
You've never died, but you do your own, you know. But I get calls from property owners who got an elevation certificate 4 or 5 years ago, and something's happened. And I say died because I've actually had 3 situations where the guy died, but sometimes they just retire or move out of state.
Okay. Those are good things to be aware of.
Yep. You got a
There
question,
was-
Tom?
Yeah, I was trying to read that one and make sure I understand that question from Tom Jacobs.
I think it's in relation to like revalidation letters, maybe.
I think that would be what it's related to.
And Tom can go off.
Well, I think directly related to LOMRs with LOMAs in that area. So not like our typical revalidation for like a PMR or a countywide study.
So LOMRs are reviewed.
So Tom, I worked on one down in Harvey County where they did a LOMR, and they invalidated all previous LOMAs because of the LOMR, even though they shouldn't have done it. And it created a big problem. People had to resubmit.
Hey, can I speak?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Steve, that's exactly what we had happen. I believe, although I don't know where the direction came from, whether it was just from the lender or from FEMA, but we had done a series of LOMAs within a reach of a larger watershed. And then we did a LOMR, and a particular property owner who was charged insurance called up and said, well, can you help me out here? And so I gave the property owner the LOMA that was approved prior to the LOMR. And he came back and said, well, this would not be accepted because it is superseded by the LOMR. Just wondering what the straight scoop is on that. Sounds like just what you said, Steve, like they were rejected, but they really shouldn't be, possibly.
Yeah, I guess my initial, this is John, my initial impression, those should not have been rejected. They should have been reviewed and brought forward. Interesting.
Yeah, I think that does get missed on LOMRs a lot. But I mean, like Steve said, you can have them resubmitted and reevaluated, and I don't think there's an additional fee to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Not if they still have all the paperwork.
If
Right.
FEMA does or the owner.
The submitter, I would think.
The owner.
Yeah, the owner, they would have to have the original one that they could then submit on the new form and reference back to it. But, interesting.
As long as the surveyor didn't die.
As long as-
All right, thanks.
If there are any surveyors on the call, I wish you a long and happy life.
Okay.
Okay, I was wondering, I don't see any other questions in there, but I was wondering if everybody might need like a 5-minute break. Or if everybody's okay to go on. Any preferences? You could click yes or no, or yes, you want a break. Your participant window, let's go on, okay. Okay, well then, I see some yeses, some nos. I might request a 5-minute break if that's okay.
Absolutely. 5
Okay,
minutes. We'll
let's take a
start.
5-minute.
We'll start again at 11:20 then, or is it, give a time, I guess, or 11:17. That seems a little odd to give a.
Let's just do 11:17. We'll do 5 minutes.
All right. All right.
See you guys in just a few minutes. Okay, I'm showing that it's 11:17, so we could go ahead and get restarted. I did have some concerns on the time for the presentation, and other people having another obligation at noon. So John, I just wanted to emphasize that we need to be sure we get that quiz done before noon so that people can get to other meetings if needed.
Absolutely. Yep. We'll go
Okay,
through
thank
the
you.
next part, make sure that gets accomplished. I should
Okay.
be able to be done by 11:45-ish here, so.
Okay, great. Well, I will turn it back over to you to continue this training.
Okay, so we left off with the MTEZ LOMA form. And again, that's an amendment. These will all be amendments. After the MTEZ LOMA form, all the rest of them follow the MT1 application forms. And depending on what it is, so like if it's a LOMA, you'll have to provide the property information form, the elevation form, the payment information form, and the other same information as the MTEZ form. A couple things to note, like if you're doing a LOMR F, for instance, you certainly would want to provide plans for that. And then also, if you're doing a CLOMAR F, then you'll have to do an Endangered Species Act compliance check as well. And I have an example of that, of what we've done in the past. The MT1 form, I'm going to pull that up and then I'll zoom in so everybody can read it. So the MT1 form is pretty well developed as well. You have to check box what you're applying for. So if it's a LOMA that's on an existing grade or natural grade, if you're doing a conditional, so basically you're proposing to put a structure, but that isn't elevated on fill, then you would check box that. The LOMR F is similar as a LOMA, except that it's a structure or parcel that has been elevated by fill. So usually you'll have to develop some sort of topographic map or information associated with that to be able to show what has been developed. And then if it's CLOMR F, it's the conditional. So initially you'll provide the design plans or what you're proposing to do. And then once that's been developed and actually been put out in the field, then you would follow up with a LOMR later on. The next section here discusses if there is fill, when was it placed? Or if you're proposing to put fill, when are you going to put fill out there? If you check yes, that you will be placing fill on the property, you'll notice that there's an asterisk here and it asks you to do an Endangered Species Act compliance check to ensure that those conditions are being met. Another thing to note here, should be pretty self-evident, but if you state that fill was placed after a project went effective, and especially if it was in like a floodway, that's going to draw some red flags, because technically you should have this approved before you go through that process. So just be aware of that. Street address, and I guess since I had mentioned the Endangered Species Act, let's go ahead and address that. The most common way that I've seen this be addressed is you file a simple letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that basically provides a project narrative and information about what you're planning on doing, to basically get them to respond and attest that yes, your activities are not going to impact any endangered species. And I have an example of a letter that I can show you for that. Yeah. Here's an example of a letter, common format letter that I use. I tailor it a little bit depending on the location, but you know, it's essentially a letter that goes out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and gets them to respond that the activities are not likely to adversely affect any critical habitat or endangered species within the development site. Again, this is a pretty common one. The things that I change on here are oftentimes the species, the locations obviously will change that are I purposely highlighted those out. Those are all going to be changed depending on the site that I'm working in. But there's a really nice tool, actually. This IPAC project planning tool is pretty handy. I don't know if Steve or if you or others have played with it or not, but
I've played with it, John. I even generated a letter for a fictional project on my own farm just as a test. However, the last person I talked to at FEMA says FEMA will not accept letters from IPAC as being official determinations from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
really, that's interesting considering FEMA has template letters out there.
Yeah, what can I tell you about that?
Well, the other thing and we haven't really talked about this a lot, but the ESA process and FEMA, in their changes coming with that too, or refinements to that?
FEMA is going to issue guidance about endangered species, and they are supposed to issue that roughly 2 years ago, the 1st of December. So we should be getting it any time now.
Okay. Well, I'll show this example. Sounds like there's been situations where this hasn't been approved, but I can tell you that there have been situations and several other reasons where it has.
Do it and turn it in and see what happens.
But basically, I fill out this letter and then I go through this tool. And this tool, what it actually does is it develops a report that I deliver with the letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife as evidence that I've walked through their process to identify any potential endangered species. And in the narrative, I talk about the activities associated with the project and how they could or could not impact the endangered species or critical habitat. So an example of the report that comes out of this is right here. One second. So this is the resource list that comes out of this, and basically it talks about all the different types of endangered species that could be impacted by the development. It provides contact information for the local offices for that project site. And you know, so for instance, for this project site, here are the mammals and the birds. There were no critical habitats associated with the site. And your inputs into this is a polygon essentially into the tool, and which I can show you up above. There's the polygon into the tool, and it basically does a search in the back end to determine what species or critical habitats there might be for this different location. And then it also gives you specific acts associated with those that may be applicable for you to look at as part of your ESA evaluation. But like in this case here, this is a pretty simple example, but in this case here, I had a project site that, let's see if I can find the map for it. I had a project site that was on agricultural lands. And the project was never proposed to impact any of the forested areas. It was only on an ag field. And so in the letter that I provided to them, oops, wrong one. In the letter here, I basically talk about the fact that the project will not be disturbing any sort of agricultural or will not be disturbing any natural habitats, and they would only be disturbing agricultural row crop production areas. and therefore the impacts and disruption would be, there just wouldn't be any that's not already occurring. And I've seen that done like this in other areas with that IPAC planning tool resource list. And I've submitted that in the past in some areas, and that has been approved in the past. So sounds like it's not been approved in other areas, and we probably need to keep a close eye on that ESA guidance that comes out eventually to make sure that we're following along with their expectations. Obviously for like LOMRs, where you have, wetlands and things like that, this is not going to fly. You have to do an environmental impact study. You have to evaluate how you're impacting that environment and make sure that you're following along with all the requirements associated with that, for sure. So.
So Steve did have a question in the chat if you've ever had an endangered species that affected a project, John.
Yes, we did. We had a project where I'm trying to remember what the species was now. It was actually in North Carolina. But we had a project that was going to impact, what was it? I can't remember what the species was now. I think it was an amphibian of some kind. But essentially what we had to do is we actually had to get a biologist to evaluate the project, and then we had to create mitigative actions on the project that attested to that we would no longer be impacting that endangered species, essentially is what we ended up doing. And I wish I had an example right handy, but I don't, Steve. I apologize. And that had to be signed off by the regulatory authorities in that region. Basically, they had to approve it, and that was submitted as background information as part of the application process. Okay. Street address, legal description, again, all that's going to come from the deed and other information, just like on the MTEZ form. All this is going to be very much the same type of information on the MTEZ form. There's a list of things here that, again, have to be provided. So you have to have a copy of the effective firm panel, again, the division property deed, the elevation form, which I'm going to show you here in a minute, which is down below. If you have LOMR Fs or CLOMR Fs, as Steve mentioned, there's a community acknowledgement form, and I'll scroll down to that. And then documented the ESA compliance, that's a checkbox you have to go through. You'll notice that this is for CLOMR Fs. However, if you're doing a LOMR or a project, it's just good practice to go through this, even at a high level, to make sure that you get concurrence from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other permitting agencies that your activities not going to cause any issues. Because the last thing you want to do is, if you decided to skip a CLOMR F, go out there and develop it and then try to permit it just for it to bounce back. That'd be no bueno. So you might want to make sure you go through that process. Processing fees, we've talked about that. I remember, a common thing that may happen is you may select the wrong fee. Just make sure you review these, and if you have any questions, that you contact FEMA to make sure that you're selecting the right fee category that it falls in. That's a certification. Here's the elevation form. So a lot of this is similar to what's on the FEMA or the MTEZ form that you need to fill out. Again, the community panel number or property address. Are the elevations listed below based on existing or proposed fill? So, if it's proposed, obviously we should be checking that it's a CLOMR instead of a LOMR F. What type of space is it on? That's the same as what it was before. again, the elevation information, we've talked about all that. Filling in this information will come from the surveyor. They will be able to fill in all this information. The lowest lot elevation, the lowest adjacent grade to structure, and the BFE, these are required to make sure that, like for the structure, to make sure what the determination is based on. And then this all has to be completed and sealed by the surveyor or professional engineer, so that they can make a determination on your elevations. You actually have the option, if you are doing multi-lot or multi-structure, you can actually list multiples here, and they have a separate page that's for documenting each one of those for that process. This is the community acknowledgement form. It's really important, and I'm just make this statement up front. Anytime you have a project, get the community involved as early as you possibly can, so that we're making sure that they're following their requirements wherever that may be, and especially if they're more stringent than what the state or FEMA has. You want to get them involved early on, but this is the official place where the community will review your information, and usually what I submit to the community to get them to sign off on it is essentially a copy of this form in draft format with the plan sets. Like if it's for a LOMR F, I'll actually attach the plan sets of the development and all the information associated with it. And I let the community review it in its complete draft form. And then I get them to sign this, and this ultimately is what gets submitted up through FEMA. If the property is located within the regulatory floodway, there's an additional check by the community to make sure that they have checked their floodplain management rules and have reviewed it, and to make sure that it's that the project follows their guidelines. And if it's in the floodway, if you're placing fill within a floodway, obviously we need to make sure that we have a no-rise certification being completed associated with that. And then the payment information is down below. I think we've got some questions. Maybe this would be a good time to answer some of those.
Yeah, so Steve asked, when is the MT1 mandatory for a LOMA request?
Oh, had people use the wrong form. Yeah. So if you have a LOMA that is based off of fill, then it has to use an MT1. The MTEZ form is only applicable for LOMAs that are based on natural ground or ground that has been grandfathered in, I guess would be the other way of saying it. I've seen that actually approved in the past.
Thank you, John. I was hoping you'd also mention that MT1 for LOMA is mandatory if it's a commercial property or if your LOMA is in the floodway.
That's true too. Yep, correct. All right.
And then Steve also asked, how do you treat window wells with a LOMR F?
Window wells with the LOMR F.
And Steve, I have a feeling you know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, what?
In interest of time, I'll take that one, John. And
Yeah.
so I told you to measure the bottom of the window well for your lowest adjacent grade for LOMA. You do the same thing with a LOMR F. However, FEMA will not accept intervening higher ground. If the lag at the bottom of the window well is below the BFE, FEMA will reject the LOMR F. And they're saying that is because with a LOMR F and fill is being brought in, their map was never wrong. You are trying to change the conditions of the map, and they have to evaluate the risk situation. It can be confusing that a window well with a LOMA gets approved on a window well with a LOMR F that looks almost exactly the same gets denied.
Yeah, I suppose there is probably some technical justification associated with that, in that, if you're bringing in fill, there may be wetting properties associated with that, that, water could more easily infiltrate into the window well, therefore the risk associated with it getting in could be, I suppose, greater. I suppose there is a possible technical reasoning behind that, I suppose.
Okay. And then the other question from Steve is, has FEMA ever approved a LOMR F without a community form being turned in?
I've never seen one approved, but then again, I've always completed one. Steve, have you actually seen that before?
In 10 years or so, I've had 2 communities that have complained to me that they never signed a community acknowledgement form, but a LOMR F was issued.
Yeah, that's got to be the exception, not the rule, because because as part of the review process by FEMA, they're checking these forms. So I guess the only way that would be done is if somebody either it was a human error that the reviewer just happened to miss it, or somebody fraudulently signed the form and submitted it. Either way is not, that would not be good.
Okay, and Steve had one other question. Does FEMA consider endangered plants for ESA compliance or only animals? And he had asked that one earlier and I think I overlooked it. So that was related to the previous section.
Endangered plants, interesting. Well, they certainly evaluate ecosystems. So like I mentioned before, wetlands, which would have a specific type of ecosystem, and plant types, those are definitely considered. So I guess in a way, yes. Although most of the stuff that I've seen has usually been based off of, and I guess the way I would state that is that would probably fall under like a critical habitat. When they talk about species, they're usually referring to animal species, so like mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, things of that nature. But habitats, it would probably fall under a critical habitat, I would think.
Had one about 7 years ago rejected for a species of plant. More recently, I'm hearing that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not looking at plants so much when they issue their determinations.
Yeah, but it is an ecosystem thing though, right, Steve? I mean, it's still, if it's like a wetland or a specific type of ecosystem, those would certainly be caught, I would think.
Yeah, and I'm still waiting for that endangered species comprehensive guidance from FEMA, which they will issue just as soon as they settle all the lawsuits against them for endangering all the species.
All right. Is there any other questions out there as far as this MT2 or MT1?
So I see Logan Mills says he missed the answer to the question about the basement and the LOMR F. And if we could repeat that answer.
Okay, the window well one.
The basement in the LOMR F question.
Would you like some help, John?
Well, I'm trying to remember which question was the basement one.
It was,
I
I asked
remember
it during
the-
the first part of this deal, but if you scroll up to the community form, you're on the property form. Can you go to the community form?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so you're in the community form, and in the middle of that big statement there where you see ESA several times, there's also a statement in there that says that any proposed project meets the community's floodplain management regulations. It's in the middle of that paragraph. I don't have control over your pointer. So if somebody tells you they're going to build a basement in a fill pad, well, basements don't comply with your floodplain regulations if the floor of the basement is below the base flood elevation. So a community official can't sign this form if somebody comes in and says, I'm going to do this fill pad, and then I'm going to dig a basement in it.
I gotcha. Right.
And then if they don't sign the form, then by what John said earlier, then FEMA should not approve a LOMR F for the property.
Right.
And if you want to make the answer really complicated, FEMA even issued a book about how to build basements in LOMR Fs, which completely contradicts this form. It's Technical Bulletin, I think 10.
Logan, did you have a different question, or is that the question you're referring to?
Thank you for your help, Tony.
Can you guys hear me? This is Joe Hickle.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Steve, the question I have about this matter you're talking is, if a LOMR F is approved and the pad's been removed from the floodplain, which was the intent of building the houses, then the question then becomes, well, is the basement in the floodplain? Because the pad, our MABCD
So Joe,
building department wouldn't issue a building permit if the structure's in the floodplain. But what they do is ask for a LOMR F, get the pad out of the floodplain, and then erect the house. If the erection of the house would have included a then that's where the question starts to come in.
So this form says proposed project. Doesn't even have to be built. It could just be the intention is to build a house with a basement.
Yeah.
If they intend to build a house with a basement, the city of Wichita, nobody working for your community should sign this form because it doesn't comply with your regulations. Now, what happens if you had a LOMR F that was done like 15, 20 years ago and that pad's been sitting there all this time and it's already been approved by FEMA? Well, for that one, you don't have any real regulatory, you don't have a stick to hold over them because the LOMR F's already been approved and your floodplain regulations only apply to the mapped floodplain. And it's not in the mapped floodplain anymore.
Right.
So that one you'd be kind of stuck with, but going forward, don't ever sign that form if the developers are intending to build basements in those fill pads.
All right, good to know.
And you and I can talk more about this offline, because we're kind of pushing for time here on this class, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Okay, so I think I had talked through all that. I guess just to round it off, some lessons learned that I've kind of, the common things that have been issues for permits or for applications not getting accepted have been, make sure to accommodate for those datum conversions and the elevations on the MT1 applications is what I'm referring to, not the MT2. That there's a whole separate list for that. But for these MT1s, that's a pretty common one. Making sure to check where the fill is being placed. Just not orient yourself with where the regulatory floodplain and floodways are. Inadvertently putting fill in a floodway versus the floodplain has caused some issues in the past. I've seen it to where not all the communities have been identified. So like, you may have a piece of property and development that's actually impacting multiple jurisdictions. You need to make sure that each jurisdiction fills out a community acknowledgement form, and those are submitted to FEMA. Check that the ESA compliance has been, you've gone through that process. It sounds, as we've mentioned multiple times, there's new guidance coming for that. The payment level, again, with the payment level, my biggest recommendation is just call FEMA and just talk to them about it and make sure you're selecting the most appropriate one. If you're doing a LOMR F activity, make sure that you are using methods that are approved by FEMA. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow, but that's one part that I've seen be a sticking point in the past. Make sure to use the online submission process where you can. I really do think that helps streamline the process and keeps everything a lot cleaner. Again, I always recommend doing the CLOMR F before a LOMR F. Technically, depending on the activity, you could do the LOMR F. You could develop it and do the LOMR F later, but I think that is ill-advised, and it creates risk on the community and the applicant as well. Even if they have a no rise in hand, I just recommend doing a LOMR F. And regardless of the outcome of these submissions, I think it's very important that we just remind our public and the property owners, it's always worth investing in the flood insurance regardless of the outcome. Just because we check a box to say that, you know, you're above a certain elevation, there's always a flood. And you know, I think FEMA states that over 25% of the claims that are made are outside of the special flood hazard area, which I've heard different numbers associated with that. But the point I'm making is even if they get it, that's even the better. It makes the investment cheaper for them to invest, and it's just good peace of mind to have. And then that's again the resources page that I had shown before.
All right, thank you, John. I think that we will go ahead and bring up the poll questions. And again, you'll have to answer these in order to get your CEC credits. We will have 3 poll questions. So I will begin by launching the first one. I see results coming in. It says, what does LOMC stand for? Okay, we have 87% of people have voted. I'll give it just a little more time here to see if anyone else is going to participate. Okay. My power just kind of flickered, but I'm still here. Sorry. All right. Let me bring up the next poll question. It looks like most of you answered that correctly, that it stands for letter of map change. Okay, so no, that's not what I wanted to do. Excuse me. Sorry. Get to the next question. Here we go. What does LOMR F stand for? Okay, it looks like most of you have voted on that. I'll give it just a couple more seconds here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end that one. And so the answer to that one was, as all of you got right, was the letter of map revision based on fill. Okay, and our last question for today, I'll launch that one. If I have a letter of map change, then I will not flood and do not need flood insurance. True or false? Okay, looks like everyone's voted for that one. So I'll go ahead and end that poll. Thank you guys for participating. The answer to that one is false. There's no guarantee that just because you have a letter map change that you will not flood. So as John mentioned, that there are a number of floods that occur outside of the special flood hazard area. Okay, were there any other questions that came up? Any other
You mentioned something you want to talk about, piling dirt around a crawl space and then applying for a LOMR F. I guess he's referring to a specific class that he has.
John, I've had people more than once, in fact, dozens of times here in the great state of Kansas, that have piled the dirt against the outside of their crawl space foundation and then applied for a LOMR F. And the community signed off on it. And the LOMR F was not only rejected, but it was flagged as a violation of the community's floodplain management regulations, because by piling the dirt around the crawl space, they made the interior of the crawl space below grade on all four sides, and that created a basement in the floodplain where basements are not allowed. And so it's flagged as a violation, and Donald Masterson has gotten 2 of those calls in the last roughly 180 days, and he had to go out and investigate, which really means he made me investigate what had happened that allowed that, to see if the community was still in compliance with their floodplain regulations. Because, John, you know what you're doing and you're not involved in any of these weird things, but I get all those calls.
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, it happens. It happens everywhere. I mean, are there any other questions out there amongst the group or situations that you've ran across? I mean, we got some time here. I mean, is there a situation? What I intended this class to be for was to be more situational type experiences that can be shared as a group. So does anybody have any particular situations they want to share and talk about? Yeah. 49 folks here and they're all very quiet.
Yeah, remember you might be on mute, but feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share anything.
And since we have a class tomorrow, like if there's something that you don't think we'll know the answer to right away, we could try and research and come, answer tomorrow too. I think that.
Okay. Well, again, I want to apologize for the mix up there on the link. I know some of you had some issues joining. Oh, I see another question. How frequently does an engineering study show that fill in a floodway is permissible?
That's a great question, actually. So from a technical standpoint, it depends on the situation, but and this might be actually harder for people to maybe realize, but actually if you have a steady state one-dimensional HEC-RAS model, which is what a lot of our studies are out there today, it's usually a little harder to do a no rise for that, and it's because of the technical way the way the modeling is done. When you have a one-dimensional steady state model, not to get too geeky on everybody here, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't automatically change the flow downstream, and so it's harder for it to accommodate removing that fill out. Whereas if you have an unsteady state model where it actually compensates, like if you block that area out, it removes the fill. For whatever reason, unsteady state models can sometimes actually be more forgiving than steady state models. Now, in steady state models, the benefit that you have is If it was blocked out before and you are trying to put fill in an area that was blocked out, whether it be an ineffective flow area or a blocked obstruction or something like that, then chances are you can actually get a no rise associated with the hydraulic function of that. For an unsteady state model, the reason that we are able sometimes to get no rises for that is because that the unsteady state model has the ability to spread that water out, especially if you're talking about a really tiny small pad and a really big floodplain or a big floodway area. Generally, you do not see hardly any adjustment in the elevations associated with that. And with some compensatory storage, so basically digging some dirt out of the cross section and replacing it somewhere else, you can actually accommodate a no rise condition in those scenarios. Which I see Steve is commenting that a lot of our floodways might be miles wide, some are only a few yards wide. And yeah, what I would say is if you're trying to build in a floodway that's miles wide, you have a pretty decent chance to achieve that. And Neil's responding that not even a thousandth of a foot. And Neil, just by putting the fill in there, you probably will not accomplish that. But in most of the projects where we're proposing to put fill in, we are also proposing to take fill out. We're trying to move it around so that you can accommodate that thousandth of a foot. I mean, just here in the state of Kansas, I think I've had 3 or 4, no, more than that, 3 or 4 in the past year that have been that way.
Okay, well, that's a great question and good discussion. I see that we're almost at noon, so I want to again thank everybody for being here today. And part 2 of this training will be tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And I will resend the confirmation emails. Again, don't use that link that was included in the reminder email. I will resend the confirmation emails and use that link to join us. And again, apologize for that confusion today.
All righty. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.